What you see immediately ahead of you is Murdo, which is a white honky town. This is all Sioux land by the treaty of 1868, but the whites just came in and took it over. If you're Indian, you get your head busted. If you're white, you get your head busted. I wouldn't recommend hitchhiking to towns like this with long hair because they'll take a shot at you. It's easy rider time. Most of the pickups will have guns, and they really look askance. It's all right to buy gas and move on, but you better not be here after sundown. We were discussing a minute ago about Crow Dog, and this is the symbol of Crow Dog. This is his family symbol. It represents his great-grandfather, who was wounded twice by arrowheads and twice by bullets. This is buffalo skin, and these wounds happen at different times. He was in a number of battles, and at one time he was left on the battlefield to die, and the Indians didn't even leave their dead on the battlefield, but all of it was very much contested, and therefore it was a very dangerous thing. So I believe his name at that time was Crow, and he was shot in the water bag, according to Henry, which is this area right down in here, and left to die. And he thought he was going to die, and some coyotes came and talked to him and brought him water and food, and the sun rose, and that's this yellow and red beads here are the sunrise. And Crow Dog knew he was going to live, and he was going to devote his life to trying to end the killing between the races. That must have been in the time of Custer. There is a photograph in what you're seeing out the window now is some of the outlying area of Murdo Cemetery, Christian cemetery. At Wounded Knee, where Bigfoot is buried, they had a Catholic cemetery surrounding Bigfoot. And so an Indian who was born and brought up at Wounded Knee and died could not be buried with Bigfoot unless he was a card-carrying Catholic until AIM took it over. We cross over and go west. The situation then with Crow Dog was there's a picture in the museum at Wounded Knee showing Crow Dog next to Sitting Bull, Spotted Tail, and Bigfoot, who was eventually killed. This was taken in 1865, the year before Custer got wiped out. I'm not sure if Crow Dog was at the Custer battle, but he may have been. But he was obviously in a number of battles of his people. In 1881, the Indians had been put on the reservation from the Treaty of 1868, and because Spotted Tail, the government had appointed Spotted Tail as the chief executive, and it all went to his head, Crow Dog killed him. Pulled out a shotgun one day and killed him. And so the whites arrested him, took him to Deadwood up in the Black Hills, and tried him for murder. And that's the campsite, I guess. Oh, and there's an old fort there for the tourists. Teepee Village campground. Come out to Indian land and give your money to the whites. All the tourists give their money to white people, and the Indians get none of this. And yet it's all Indian land, and people come out to see Indians in Indian ways. Yeah, okay, so he killed Spotted Tail and was taken to the white man's court in Deadwood in the Black Hills. He admitted the killing, was tried for murder, and convicted. And they built a scaffold. This was November 1883 now. And he had a lawyer who thought that the government lacked jurisdiction and filed a brief with the Supreme Court, but it took many days with stagecoaches and the rest. And many weeks passed, and Crow Dog wanted to go home and say his goodbye to his wife. And so he asked his lawyer, and the lawyer asked his judge if they let him go home on parole for a month. And it freaked the town out. I mean, what if, here is an admitted, convicted murderer, and you're not going to let him out of jail? But the judge said, well, Crow Dog seems to be an honorable man, we'll do that. And so let him out, and he went home in the winter of 1883 for several weeks, sang his death songs, gave all his possessions away, and then climbed on his horse and came back to Deadwood and walked into his death cell. That's where his head was at, and blew everybody's mind. And so then the affidavit came from the Supreme Court that the U.S. District Court here, South Dakota, had no jurisdiction over Indians, and therefore they couldn't try them for a crime committed on the Indian reservation. So Crow Dog was set free, went back to his tribe. And it's funny about this because traditionally, since they had no courts or laws or jail, almost everything was forgiven except homicide. And the penalty for that was usually that you were ostracized, you were kicked out of the tribe. But Crow Dog wasn't kicked out of the tribe because 9 years later, in 1890, at the time of the Ghost Dance, he was one of the leaders of the Ghost Dance, which was a religious revival movement that swept out of Nevada, which said that if you danced this very stately dance for many days and had visions, that the white man's junk would roll up into the sea and the land would be the way it was before. And so everyone started dancing the Ghost Dance, and a new administration in Washington had changed Indian agents, and they weren't familiar with Indians, and they freaked out. They said they're going the warpath, and they should call in troops, which was absolutely the wrong thing to do because it wasn't a violent dance. There were no guns involved. It was basically a peaceful thing. But the new tribal agents thought they were going the warpath, and so the government rushed in troops onto Pine Ridge, onto Rosebud. When the troops arrived, all the bands headed out and came to a place below the Badlands called the Cooney Table and held out there for several weeks. Bigfoot, who was eventually killed in his band at Wounded Knee, was camped near Rapid City, and he wasn't quite sure what to do. In the meantime, they went to arrest Sitting Bull, who was considered to be the leader with Indian police, and the Indian police assassinated Sitting Bull. Previously, they assassinated Crazy Horse 20 years earlier. So the Indians felt it was all going to come down, they were all going to be killed, and Bigfoot fled from what he thought to be a cavalry pursuit west of it. He fled from Rapid City in this direction to get to Sitting Bull's tribe, which was north of here. He was pursued by a cavalry unit. It was the dead of winter, December, harsh winters, and but he fooled them. He was coming north of the Badlands, which are in this area here. We'll see them a little later on, off to the south. And everybody knew you couldn't cross through the Badlands in winter, particularly with women and children. And so he got ahead of the cavalry and he pulled a right turn and went through Bigfoot's Pass. And the cavalry kept going east because they knew that no one could go south. They took everything with them, including their beads. I mean, it wasn't a matter of an army traveling, it was a matter of the whole culture traveling. And so he gave the slip to the cavalry unit, which came right along here towards Sitting Bull. And Bigfoot then started heading for Pine Ridge because all the Indians were ordered into Pine Ridge. Meanwhile, Crow Dog, in those days they were considered hostiles. Today they're called militants. Held out on the Cooney Table, which was an almost impregnable place, a high plateau, very large area, which at one end had a very narrow neck and a large area, and the only way to reach that was to get on top of the plateau and get into that neck. And so they came out from some negotiators from Pine Ridge and said, look, either you come in or they're going to kill you. So Crow Dog held out initially, and they started fighting among themselves, and Crow Dog sat down and threw a blanket over his head. It was almost some of the Sioux almost killed one another. And they waited for Crow Dog to take the blanket off his head, and he said he didn't want to see Sioux killing one another. And maybe the only choice they had to do was to go into Pine Ridge and hope they wouldn't get killed. So they moved into Pine Ridge, and about a day later, Bigfoot is heading for Pine Ridge when he was caught up by the 7th Cavalry, which is Custer's old group, a very macho group, just south of Porcupine. And he put an American flag and a white flag over his group, and they negotiated and they agreed to be escorted into Pine Ridge. And they started towards Pine Ridge, and at nightfall they came into the area of Wounded Knee. And in the morning they were surrounded by federal troops, Hotchkiss guns and the rest. And it was very simple for the colonel there, Colonel Forsyth, to take them into Pine Ridge and disarm them there. However, it was a great thing to get promoted. You either had to have a head count or you had to have a collection of arms. I mean, to escort friendly Indians was nothing on the books, but to kill some Indians or to have weapons surrendered was a whole other thing. So he demanded that all the Indians surrender their weapons. Well, to the Indians, this was their survival. They couldn't hunt buffalo, what few were left, or deer or whatever. And a lot of them had paid like real money, like maybe a year's hunting for that one Winchester rifle. And so there was a danger if they tried to disarm in the field that an outbreak would happen, while on Pine Ridge there wouldn't have been a problem. So they demanded the arms, and a shot rang out, and no one's quite sure who shot it. Everyone believes it was the military. The Indians believe it. And so they opened up on all the guns, and the warriors were killed off quite early, but it became a very savage thing because the women and children went over into the ravine, and 300 people were killed, and most of them women and children. And a snowstorm came upon them, and the military went back to Pine Ridge. So the 3 days later, when they came to bury the body, they found the majority of women and children in the ravines who were trying to run away and who were obviously killed by blood-crazed soldiers. And there was the Indians even believed that they threw some people who were still alive into this they built a mass trench and threw them in. That's Bigfoot's grave, which is on this hill, which is the center of Wounded Knee. And it's been a sore point with Indians ever since the Bigfoot massacre, which up till when we took it over 2 months ago, was a white trading post. And people from all over the world who had studied up on the Indian wars and the Indian situation came to Wounded Knee to see what happened. And they had this trading post, and they could buy jeans and beer and candy bars and cigarettes and knickknacks. And Gildersleeve at the same time was buying up the land for the traditional Indians and owned a great deal of Wounded Knee area. Plus the fact that the tribal government, Dickie Wilson as they call him, and the Goon Squads had organized a really fascist police state. And they felt the only way to do it was to make a stand, take over Wounded Knee, take hostages, and demand that Wilson is out. So we took it over, and in 2 or 3 days we were surrounded by, in fact in one day we were surrounded by the FBI and federal marshals, and they said they wouldn't negotiate until the hostages were released. So Abe said, okay, we'll release the hostages, and none of the hostages wanted to leave. They said, this is our home. We haven't been mistreated. We want to live here. And it blew the government's case. So that basic, and Crow Dog is the leader now. Crow Dog on the reservation was respected. The old man, the grandfather, died I guess about 1901, 1902. He had 3 wives, was highly respected, even though he killed Spotted Tail. However, the Crow Dog family has been always repressed by the government, because the government side is that Crow Dog was a killer and killed Spotted Tail. So it's still called, like the college there, or the extension school, is called Spotted Tail School. And the Crow Dogs have always been dumped on. And even the blood guilt traditionally goes for 4 generations. That if you kill somebody, there was something wrong with you, or something wrong with your bloodline. And the 4th generation is Leonard. So even today, and even when he was a kid, if someone gets mad at Crow Dog, they say, Crow Dog killed Spotted Tail, meaning that Leonard killed Spotted Tail, when in fact it was his great-grandfather. That's eliminated, I believe, with Crow Dog's son, Richard Kay, who is now growing up.
How old is his son?
3 or 4. All right, 4th generation now. And so Crow Dog is the spiritual advisor of AIM, and very strong spiritual advisor. When the FBI got on the old CV equipment, when the FBI first came over that hill, they were shooting at us, and they decided to negotiate, and this one car came over a hill, much further than that hill, and this guy came out in this shiny suit, and he had his hands out, like not out, but sort of out, and saying, "Hi there, I'm your friendly FBI agent." And he said he wanted to negotiate with the Indians. There was another guy a little further back, but no guns. But we could see he had handcuffs behind his back, but no gun on him apparently. And the demand was, because McGovern was going to come in, and Aberrest was, senators were going to come in, that they would not negotiate as long as the hostiles were there. And so, and they only negotiated in Pine Ridge. And there was some discussion whether they should go in Pine Ridge, and Crow Dog said, no, that we have to negotiate in no man's land, put up a teepee in no man's land. And the FBI was very heavy. He said, we're not going to discuss that. you want to negotiate, you got to come to Pine Ridge. And then it said, I can no longer be the spiritual advisor of AIM if we negotiate in Pine Ridge. So they said, we negotiate right here. So he went back, the FBI went back, next day he came back, and by that time some press had sneaked in. CBS had come in and other press, and they had microphones, and the FBI came up, and they brought one of the ex-hostages up and said, we're now going to, the FBI guessed, we can't talk to you unless the hostages are released. And they said, well, we have one of the people who live here, and he's got something to tell you, which was in effect that they were no longer hostages, they weren't going to leave. And the FBI said, I don't want to hear you. And the press had put microphones up and said, what do you mean? You're not going to talk to one of the people? He said, I haven't got authority to talk to the hostages. And finally, the press overwhelmingly forced him to admit to the fact that the hostages talked to him and said, we've been released, we're free to go, and nobody wants to go. He had his child, his 10-year-old child there. So that blew the government's case right away. And within a week, though, the government came out with an ultimatum that anyone who was not willing to get shot at had to leave by sundown in 2 days. So almost all the white people got in a truck and split. I mean, the people who lived there. They were afraid of getting killed. The government also ordered the press out, and some of the press left and some of the press stayed. The government did. McGovern came in the third night with apparatus and was and the AIM people said, why did you come in? We don't even want you. He said, well, we want to set up hearings in Washington, but it'll take 3 weeks. Would you please put your arms down now, and we'll have hearings in Washington in 3 weeks? They said, absolutely not. We've heard that one before. We're not laying down our arms until we get some type of guaranteed commitments that we believe to be true from the government, and that still hasn't happened.
Who was just killed?
Who was just killed?
Yeah, who was just killed in there?
A young woman. I don't have her name. It's 17-year-old girl. Well, it looks like it's true. So there are now 3 people killed. Frank Clearwater, another young man from the Oglalas, and apparently a young woman. And situation in Wounded Knee, if you look at this land right here, if you look at those houses over there, those would be APC, Armored Personnel Carriers. And this is our defense perimeter. And they've got machine guns on the roof, and there's 2 of them. And they can shoot very readily. And the entire perimeter is surrounded by those now. And they fire down. Even when there's a ceasefire, the honky FBI and federal marshals will sometimes move the APC down to draw a fire. We've got mostly 22s and 60-year-old Italian rifles, which we can't find shells for. While the government has APCs, M16s, which are semi-automatic. They've got several helicopters. I went out one day several weeks ago because I thought there might be some firing because they had fired earlier. I was walking, if you look at the side of the road here, there's sort of a little dip, and all of a sudden everybody opened up, and I found myself in a very difficult situation of bullets flying all over me, because right ahead of me was our bunker, the Denby bunker, and ahead of the Denby bunker was the government's position on the Denby Road, and they were firing right at that bunker, and what was missing the bunker was coming, that's a 22.
That's what they use.
Yeah, that's what we use, that's a 22. The government shells are 3 or 4 times that large. And so I had a difficult thing, and they were firing almost directly at me, and what was missing in the Denby bunker was going zing, zing, zoom, zoom. And I was really scared. I thought of putting the camera up and being a hero. I wouldn't stand up, I would be a dead man. But I was afraid of losing my arm, and so what I did was I took the porta pack and the deck and put it in front of my head and tried to get it down as low as possible, figuring I was there for about 2 hours until nightfall. I think on a certain times I'd go into fire, but at that point I'd already hit the ground. I could hear the bullets continually going over my head, and I felt the best thing to do was to let the porta pack take the impact. We weren't hit, but then for several days later, you go just back over my head up the road, and it was covered with bullets. The whole place was saturated. They would fire in like 10,000 rounds and think nothing of it. Meanwhile, the bunkers were getting hit all the time. We've got some excellent audio in there of the bunker getting hit. We have some videotape inside, several hours of Crow Dog. Well, not only is a medicine man, but he's a doctor. When someone is shot, he takes the bullet out. If there's a pain, he says, "Here, I want you to chew on this root." So a very powerful man. And we have some videotapes inside of what he's talking about. We're outside. We're traveling towards Rapid City on Interstate 90, which is a major interstate highway.
Is that two-strike?
Two-strike, yeah, South Dakota. On your right, get this. They're now recreating a western town. They're just building it. I'm sure by this summer for the tourist trade, the 3 million people reach the Black Hills. This will be a typical western town where you can get out and spend a lot of money. They'll have a fake saloon and a fake museum. Buffalo Burger, right? And drop all your money here and never see an Indian.
You never have to go into a western town.
That's right, and all the trinkets will be from Japan. And people will come through here and do their number. Barbershop, trading post, etc.
Western gas station.
Right. And that's the way it is. And 3.5 million people in western South Dakota, particularly Rapid City. It lives off of Ellsworth Air Force Base, which has SAC bombers going over to bomb North Vietnam all the time in shuttles. And it has the Black Hills. And everybody either lives off Ellsworth Air Force Base, the Black Hills, or else everybody else takes in everybody else's laundry. And when Rapid City, the creek washed out, I guess, 500 houses, the medicine men said Rapid City had it coming. Rapid City has some of the worst karma you'll ever experience when you get there. The whole thing is really bad medicine. I hope to be going back in, and I thought I'd mention about how we get out. I've gone out twice now. I went out the first week to take money to Rosebud and Messages, and I walked north through the lines. Every few minutes the government shoots a flare off, and so the entire area with a parachute becomes illuminated, and they burn off all the grass, and they burn off a lot of houses. They would try and fire the flares to burn us out, and at night everything you see would be a prairie fire at times. Fortunately, the village was never burned out, but they tried their darnest to do it. When I went out, the security wasn't that tight from the government. I was worried about getting shot by our own people, who were somewhat trigger happy in the early days. And I went out past the church towards Porcupine. Once I got through the lines, I walked all night and finally reached Porcupine. And I guess I was one of the early ones to go out, because I wasn't sure that Porcupine, which is 7 miles by road and about 10 by walking up and down, and much more heavily wooded than you see here, I wasn't sure it wasn't going to be surrounded by federal troops, because we weren't sure what was on the outside. And Crow Dog's wife, Renona, gave me her mother to look up. So I snuck into town at dawn, and then went over to Sievert Youngbull, who gave me a ride to Rapid City. In Rapid City, I got a ride down to Crow Dog's. And the way I got back in, I had heard that, what's his name, Bill Kunstler was going to come in to help defend the Indians. And I met him very briefly before I hitchhiked out here, because the Onondagas did a benefit at Syracuse University for Leroy Shenandoah, and he gave me a message to give to Russell. So I heard on the radio, driving from Porcupine to Pine Ridge, that Kunstler was going to fly the next day, and I had his phone number, so I called him up and said, "I'll get you into Wounded Knee." So I had a friend. We picked up Kunstler at the airport. We drove in through the roadblock, and Kunstler said I was his legal assistant. So that's how I got back into Wounded Knee, because they only let at that time lawyers. And I guess I was, because I described the legal situation to Kunstler on the way down. The other thing is, the reason I came out the second time was because it became very evident early that we had to have communication with the outside world. We had one phone line before it was cut. We needed video equipment. We needed radio equipment. I sent out 4 messages through the lines. They all said approximately the same thing. It said, "Urgent from Crow Dog or Wounded Knee. We need a video and radio transmission system so our voice will get to the outside world. This is Crow Dog speaking." That went out 4 times and nothing ever happened. So I came through the lines for a night about 2 weekends ago. It was much heavier then because the cauldron had been tightened. There were more APCs around us, and I decided to go due west towards Calico. And they were still firing flares. It was a full moon that night, so I snuck out through past our bunker. I identified myself so they wouldn't shoot me, and I went out over one of the burnout hills very carefully. I could be seen by one of the pig bunkers, but I figured they probably wouldn't be looking my way with a backpack, and slowly got through the lines. I walked 12 miles to the Pine Ridge Rapid City Road. We're still in the Pine Ridge Reservation, and I was in danger at that point of getting arrested. And I searched then for an old medicine man named Pete Ketches, who was a Sundance leader, figuring I could hide out at his place until he got me a ride. I couldn't get a hold of him, so I decided I risk it and play like I was just a hippie passing through, and got several rides, and finally arrived to Rapid City. The situation with food is very critical. Backpackers go in almost every night. We used to get all of them through up to 3 weeks ago when they brought in dogs, and they're killer dogs that don't bark, but once they get at you, they grab for your throat. They have trigger flares, so Wounded is much more dangerous to get into now. They have trigger flares, so if you trip over a line, a flare will go up. They have roving patrols on horses, so only about 1 in 4 gets through now, and you have to have the spirits with you, and it's a difficult thing, but people still try it every night. What's needed is an airplane, like a 2-engine job. An airplane landed about the 3rd week and dropped off something, but it was just a light plane. The difficulty in getting in is that you come over the hill and there you are. You're getting shot at by the Federals. You have to fly under you have to fly in. There's a road that curves like this, and it's not too long. It's about 4 times the distance you can see immediately in front of you right here, and you've got to fly over some telephone poles and under some others and land. Once I get in, the first thing I'm going to do is cut the telephone poles, all of them, and put up a big windsock.
What about dropping parachutes?
That's been done, but you need a windsock because they'll drift over the Federal lines. The only assured way is to get a 2-engine plane, a fairly big one, and fly it in and not expect to get it back out and store it there for the duration. The people there are down to 1 meal of oatmeal a day. The government's trying to starve them out. The feeling was that they have a difficult time taking the place without killing everybody. And we were all committed on the inside. I'm basically non-violent. I didn't pick up a gun and do any firing, but I thought if they came in to kill us, I would pick up a weapon or anything else and defend us. In fact, we have a videotape inside of a drill of the people who didn't have weapons, had homemade axes and clubs of women.